Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman, author of the book Brothers, Sisters, Strangers. And this is so important for us to be doing this particular topic today because the notion that we're going to be talking about is psychological time. And this is something that all of us go through in some ways. How does psychological time weigh down on us? There's so many aspects related to this that end up doing different things to us. And if we're not careful, it can get the best of us. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to talk a little bit more about that today. And of course, Fern, of course, is going to, share some insights about that to get us started. Fern, welcome.
Thanks, Sally John. Always great to be with you. And yeah, I always seem to have some little story I want to attach to our topic. I think psychological time affects all of us in or out of estrangement, and we're very aware of it in the sense that when you're unhappy or miserable, time seems to slow down and hang heavy on you. But there's another piece of it, and I can speak to this as the queen of rumination. I was a master at ruminating. And during my estrangement with my brother, I would have kind of a groundhog day every day. I would wake up, I would look in the mirror, and I would say to myself, what did I do? How did this happen? And so that distorted time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Because this is the thing that happens to us is that it just weighs down on us. And I think this is a good segue into what is psychological time, right? What I define as psychological time is the perception of time that we have with regards to incompleteness about our estrangement with our sibling, right? It's the idea that this incompleteness is a lack of resolution that we can all potentially experience, right, with them, but that things are left unsaid or unfixed somehow, right? And what happens, and you said it wonderfully, is that we can fall into rumination, right? And we're left like without an answer of some sort because there's no real communication going on with our sibling, you know, and it's almost as if we're waiting for the shoe to drop, right?
Well, I think there are two parts to that. And one is if you don't have a relationship that's ongoing in any way, and you don't have any idea of why you've been cut off, it really feeds the rumination. Yeah. It also contributes to a voicelessness. So you have no opportunity to make your case, apologize, because you don't even know why this has happened and what mess you're in. Now, the truth is that there are all sorts of reasons that siblings cut off, but we tend to blame ourselves. A lot of it's based on misperceptions or miscommunications or even defensiveness. So it's dangerous to take it personally as I did, but that is the default when you are uneducated and unaware of what's going on.
It's very interesting that you say that because you and I were talking a little bit about this before the video, right? About how we can somehow take things personally that are not really so much about us. And, you know, I find that this leaves us oftentimes in a heightened state that can cause us to stay stuck where we wrestle with ourselves, right? And we so much wish that there was resolution rather than ambiguity or hostility with them, right?
Right. And I think actually you've just identified what is the crux of the grief of estrangement, which is that rather than ever achieving any sort of resolution, most of us get stuck in rumination. So if you look at the 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has identified, they would be confusion, anger, helplessness, depression, and acceptance. But when you're estranged from a sibling, which has many of the same elements of grief, you never reach acceptance unless you really work on it. You get stuck in rumination.
You're absolutely right. I think that this is something that's very common for a number of us going through this. And I think that also this whole notion that I've spoken about before about relegating family to a different position inside of us, that shift needs to happen, you know, where all of a sudden family doesn't play the same role that we expect it to anymore, right? And that's the thing that's needed too, especially that can help to appease rumination ultimately, right? But this is a process that can take a while for us to get to, right?
And it's very challenging because our culture has this construct, which is you should be supported and loved and close to your family members.
Yeah.
And so to step outside of that and embrace others is going against what's been indoctrinated in each of us in Western culture.
Absolutely, you're right. You're right, and this is something that we keep on hearing a lot of, and especially we need to, of course, make sense of in our own ways, right? So, I think this is important because we're talking a lot about these internal processes, and I kind of wanted to talk about how psychological time makes us feel as well, right? And I think that, if we look at how long estrangement has occurred, when we kind of look back on our situation, this is what psychological time does to us. It makes us feel as though we're heavy. It makes us feel as though the situation is overwhelming, especially when it's been carrying on for so long, right?
Right. There's a funny line that mothers share with each other, which basically goes something like this: the days last forever, but the years fly by. And that, I think, to some extent, is psychological time.
That's very true, and I like that, because we hear about this in different places, right? This whole notion of psychological time, just like you're describing, right? And I think that the danger for us is that when we take this on ourselves, we move into personalization, right? And we've talked about that personalization and such, and how that can cause us to experience frustration, further suffering, rumination, like we're saying, because there's a lack of resolution that's happened over time, right? And what can end up happening in cases like this, of course, is that our minds turn against us, and we may even start to wonder, is this something I said, something I did that caused this to happen? And that's the very basis of rumination.
Yeah, the rumination and personalization are like the twin evils of estrangement.
Yeah. And I would even say in some ways that psychological time is the fuel for personalization. So there's a relationship between all three.
Right, so you're caught in this Bermuda Triangle.
Yes, if we're not careful, of course, And I find that with some people, especially, the thing that happens to them is that they can sometimes catastrophize their future, because if you're experiencing a wave of grief or powerlessness in your situation, there's a danger that we can extend that to ourselves, right? And this is the type of generalization that can cause us to broaden the problem and make it really seem bigger than what it is, right? If we're not careful.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to look out too far, and that will feed your anxiety.
Yeah. And oftentimes I share it with people. I always ask them some ways to be careful if they're going too long term, because what you're feeling in a moment doesn't mean you're going to be feeling that for the rest of your life.
Right. It's the weather storms of emotion.
Yeah. So that's the thing too. So what can we do about it? I think that's a really good question, right? In the end, and I always like to give some advice as to how we can work with this. And one of them is exactly what we've been saying, is to avoid branching out into the future, right? And not to go too far, right? We want to, of course, make sure that, that we understand that the future is uncertain. And if we go into a type of negative, pessimistic future, then it will cause us to become defensive. So to limit our scope, to bring ourselves back to the short term or medium term, helps us a lot.
Right, shorten your frame
Yeah,
a little bit.
exactly. And another thing that I think is really helpful also is moving into the okay with regards to the incompleteness of the situation. And I did an article actually on navigating incompleteness on siblingEstrangement.com, and I explain how to go into this exercise of moving into the okay. So this is especially important that people can work with that to help them to navigate some of these waves and some of the emotional overwhelming feeling that they can have.
Yeah, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often say to people, of course, to recognize that this is a wave, right? And it's a wave like any other types of grief as well, because the waves hit us that way. And I really like the metaphor of the oceanic waves. It comes and goes, right? And you have a choice to buy into it or not when you're going through that wave, right?
Right, it's like all grief, which comes in waves. And what you hope to do is to get out of the way of the wave crashing eventually.
Yeah, and simply not buy into the message. You know you're going through a particular state at that time, right? So be gentle towards yourself. And that's the last piece of advice that I wanted to give for today is this idea of extending self-compassion towards ourselves during the wave, right? That's really, really important that people can recognize that because we often are very hard on ourselves. We're our own worst critics. And it's so, so important that we can exercise gentleness in times of hardship for ourselves.
So I think one of the important points that you're making is that it's important to feel the grief, feel your feelings, but recognize it's not going to go on forever. And it's not like you're going to cry forever. It just doesn't happen. And in fact, until you feel the grief, you will keep staying in that rumination cycle.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's the thing that's really important is to let yourself feel the feelings that come up in terms of your capacity and such, but also work on making sure that the feeling is not overwhelming you completely. And there's a delicate balance that happens between that, right? And that's really important.
Well, and the tendency is to dodge.
Yeah,
You don't
right?
want to feel it, so you avoid it. And that actually simply fuels the same problem, which is rumination.
Exactly. So we're already approaching the end of our video for today. So this is really, really good, and I'm really, really happy we're going with this because this helps our viewers to be more empowered and such, and of course to learn to navigate their own ways and make this easier for themselves. So Fern, I wanted to ask you, what would be the #1 resource that you would recommend right now for the viewers?
I'll say the Sibling Estrangement Journal. I think it would help with psychological time because it requires the reader to write down and explore some of their feelings.
Yeah, very good resource. I like it a lot, as a matter of
Thank
fact.
you.
Yeah. The #1 resource right now, I think at this time, I haven't spoken about it yet. I think for a little while, it would be the workshop that I offer. Now, I do offer this workshop on a regular basis. It's the Improving My Self-Esteem After Sibling Estrangement. So I think that this is something that can be a very powerful workshop, an empowering workshop. I do this with a small group of people where people can sit together and go deeper into developing some experiential tools that can be especially helpful to make themselves better and empower themselves all the more. So one more thing I want to say as well before we go is we do accept some questions from our viewers. So if some of our viewers have any questions they want us to attempt to answer in some future videos, please do write to us or message us, and we will do our best, of course, to help out and see if we can attempt to answer that, of course. So
Right, we've been doing some of these case studies, and they raise really interesting questions that we might not think of ourselves. So it's extremely valuable to have that feedback.
absolutely. So thank you again for doing this, Fern. It's wonderful to have you here again to be
Thank
able to talk
you.
about this. There's so few resources out there, and I'm very, very happy with the resources we're able to offer to our community and our viewers, and hopefully we'll be able to continue again in a future video.
Right, and as some readers tell us, the music itself calms people down. So if nothing else, they can just listen to the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great to do this again with you, Fern. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you soon.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.